Gold was found. The reports were real. The samples were verified. But nothing happened. No rush, no crowds, no sudden towns rising from the dust. By the time the discovery was confirmed, the moment had already passed. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real gold, lost chances, and the decisions that shaped history, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this channel more than you might think, and allows these stories to continue. When people imagine a gold discovery, they picture chaos, wagons arriving overnight, prices exploding, men abandoning everything to chase a rumour. That is how the gold rush is remembered. But history is full of gold that arrived at the wrong time. This story is not about gold that was fake, not about a scam, not about fools chasing dust. This is a story about real gold, found too late to matter. And the question is simple. What if it had been found just 10 years earlier? The location was not obscure. It was part of the American West, land already crossed by prospectors, surveyed by officials, and mapped by rail companies. Nearby regions had produced gold before. Geology suggested the ground was not empty. Small camps had existed there earlier. Shallow digs, unsuccessful shafts. A few men stayed. Most moved on. At the time, the area lacked one critical thing: momentum. No major rush had claimed it yet. No railroad stopped there. No newspapers were running headlines. 10 years earlier, that would not have mattered. Back then, people followed rumours, not infrastructure. A handful of letters or a single newspaper column could trigger movement across states. But by the time gold was finally confirmed in this place, the West had changed. The frontier was no longer open in the same way. Land ownership was formalised. Mining required capital, permits, equipment, and patience. This was no longer the age of men arriving with pans and hope. It was the age of companies. The discovery itself was real and documented. Gold-bearing material was found in quantities that, under earlier conditions, would have justified a rush. Samples were sent out. Assays confirmed value. According to historical records, the gold was not extraordinary, but it was sufficient. Sufficient for small operators. Sufficient for local development. Sufficient to change the fate of the place. But news travels differently when enthusiasm is gone. The reports did not spread like fire. They moved slowly, cautiously, buried beneath other economic stories. Investors looked elsewhere. Miners calculated costs instead of dreaming. Speculators asked a new question. Is it worth starting now? 10 years earlier, that question would not have been asked. Gold itself would have been enough. But timing had changed the rules. And once rules change, value alone is no longer persuasive. Every gold rush has a moment, a single point where uncertainty turns into movement, where hesitation collapses into action. This place never had that moment. By the time the discovery became public knowledge, the world around it had shifted. Gold no longer existed in a vacuum. It had competition from industry, from wages, from stability. 10 years earlier, men accepted risk because there were few alternatives. Work was seasonal. Wages were low. Mobility was survival. But now, the economy offered something different. Railroads employed thousands. Factories paid regular wages. Cities promised permanence instead of possibility. Gold had not disappeared, but the hunger for it had changed. Later historical analysis suggests that discoveries like this failed not because they were small, but because they arrived after people had learned to value certainty over chance. A rush requires desperation as much as opportunity, and desperation was fading. To understand what was lost, it helps to look backward. 10 years earlier, the same discovery would have meant something else entirely. There were fewer laws, less bureaucracy, almost no environmental oversight. Claims could be staked quickly, contested violently, or abandoned just as fast. Capital requirements were low, expectations were lower. Men arrived with little more than tools and belief. By the time this gold was found, everything had changed. Mining had become industrial. Equipment costs mattered. Transportation mattered. Legal ownership mattered. A discovery was no longer an invitation, it was a proposal, and proposals require approval. Companies wanted scale, banks wanted guarantees, governments wanted regulation. Gold that could not immediately justify investment was quietly ignored. Timing did not reduce the amount of gold in the ground. It reduced the number of people willing to chase it. The losses were not dramatic. No riots, no gunfights, no dramatic collapse, just silence. Small operators who stayed behind spent years waiting for attention that never came. Local settlements planned for growth that never arrived. Land was purchased, surveyed, and then forgotten. Some families invested what little they had, not enough to attract major backing, but too much to walk away easily. They were not wrong about the gold, they were wrong about the moment. As larger rushes elsewhere drew attention, this place faded further into the background. Infrastructure bypassed it. Rail lines passed nearby but never stopped. In history books, it barely earned a footnote. Gold remained in the ground, but opportunity moved on. And unlike gold, opportunity does not stay buried. Not everyone lost. They just weren't the people standing closest to the gold. According to later historical analysis, the primary beneficiaries of delayed discoveries were not prospectors, but systems already in motion. Rail companies continued expanding toward industrial centres. Banks redirected capital into manufacturing and urban growth. Governments gained more control over land and resources through regulation. The gold did not trigger a rush, but it reinforced existing power structures. Large mining companies benefited indirectly. By avoiding marginal deposits, they reduced risk and concentrated investment in proven regions. The absence of a rush prevented competition and kept labour costs predictable. Even regions nearby benefited from comparison. While this place waited, others absorbed attention, funding, and infrastructure. Growth did not stop, it simply moved elsewhere. Timing redistributed opportunity. The gold was not worthless. It was inconvenient, and inconvenience favours those who can afford to wait. Gold discoveries trigger a specific mental reflex. People imagine an earlier version of themselves, arriving first, staking claims, rewriting their future. This reflex is powerful, and it ignores one critical variable: time. According to later historical analysis, delayed discoveries create a psychological trap. Those who find gold late often believe the mistake lies in recognition, not relevance. They assume attention will eventually arrive. It rarely does. The longer the delay, the more justification is required. What once needed belief now requires proof. What once inspired movement now demands certainty. This creates paralysis. People wait for validation. Validation never comes. The moment passes quietly. Gold remains static. Opportunity does not. By the time the trap is recognized, the cost of leaving is often higher than the cost of staying, and so people remain, anchored to timing they cannot change. Gold does not exist outside the economy. It competes. By the time this discovery surfaced, gold was no longer the fastest path to wealth. Wages were rising. Cities offered stability. Risk was optional rather than necessary. According to historical records, many potential prospectors compared expected returns and chose not to move. The math no longer favoured uncertainty. This marked a quiet transition. Gold rushes stopped being the default engine of expansion. They became exceptions, rare, explosive, and increasingly regulated. Timing determined everything. The same deposit, discovered earlier, might have transformed a region. Discovered later, it barely registered. The gold did not fail. The context did. And context, once lost, cannot be mined back out of the ground. This pattern did not end with gold. According to later economic analysis, the same timing problem appears again and again. In oil fields discovered after prices collapse, in rare minerals found after supply chains shift, and in technologies that arrive just after markets move on. Value is not fixed. It is contextual. A resource can be real, measurable, and abundant, and still fail to matter if it arrives after decisions have already been made. Infrastructure locks in direction. Capital follows momentum. Once movement chooses a path, late discoveries struggle to redirect it. The people closest to the resource often understand this last. They see what exists in the ground. They underestimate what has already moved above it. Gold was never special in this sense. It was simply one of the earliest lessons. Timing does not reward effort. It rewards alignment. And alignment is invisible until it is gone. The question was never whether the gold was real. It was. The question was whether it arrived in a world that still needed it. 10 years earlier, this discovery might have changed lives. It might have built towns. It might have rewritten maps. 10 years later, it became a footnote, not because people failed to see it, but because the future had already chosen something else. Gold does not create opportunity on its own. It waits for the moment when people are willing to move. When that moment passes, value remains, but relevance disappears. And that leaves one final question. If the same gold, in the same place, can mean everything at one moment, and almost nothing a decade later, was it the wrong discovery, or simply the wrong time?